a speech delivered in the vital swing state of Ohio on Monday, Donald Trump said that in implementing his call for a temporary ban on Muslims immigrating to the country, he would institute, quote, extreme vetting and develop a new screening test to try to catch people who intend to do harm to the United States.
In the Cold War, we had an ideological screening test. The time is overdue to develop a new screening test for the threats we face today. I call it extreme vetting. I call it extreme vetting. Our country has enough problems. We don't need more. And these are problems like we've never had before.
As president, Trump said he would ask the U.S. State Department and Department of Homeland Security to identify regions of the world that remain hostile to the U.S. and where screening might not be sufficient to catch those who pose a threat.
That is why one of my first acts as president will be to establish a commission on radical Islam, which will include reformist voices in the Muslim community who will hopefully work with us. We want to build bridges and erase divisions. The goal of the commission will be to identify and explain to the American public the core convictions and beliefs of radical Islam, to identify the warning signs of radicalization, and to expose the networks in our society that support radicalization. This commission will be used to develop new protocols for local police officers, federal investigators, and immigration screeners.
Well, now joining us to discuss this is Arun Kundnani. He writes about race, Islamophobia, political violence, and surveillance. His latest book, The Muslims Are Coming, Islamophobia, Extremism, and the Domestic War on Terror. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So how do you respond to these new proposals that Trump has, highlighted yesterday? He wants this commission to determine, what Muslims can enter the country, and he wants to do like sort of an ideological litmus test on people that are coming in.
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing is, this is a attempt to get us into a new Cold War, but this time with Islam replacing communism. That's the basic underlying idea here. And whatever you think of the old test that there used to be, which asked, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? The idea now is that would be replaced with some kind of questioning around, do you believe in Sharia law or something like that? And so we're kind of getting invited to go back into that kind of mode. The problem, I think, in thinking about this is so much of what Trump is talking about is already in place, right? I mean, we already have what Trump's calling extreme vetting. We already have that. What Trump is doing is really making much more explicit and overt in his rhetoric what is actually already, by and large, there in policy terms. I mean, talking about spotting the warning signs of radicalization. I mean, since 9/11, every law enforcement agency, immigration authorities, and so forth have been given training and so forth in a very bogus way. I mean, there is very little substance to these methodologies for spotting radicalization, but nevertheless, they're out there. They've been implemented for years.
And so, he's trying to start, as you said, a new Cold War, and he's really hearkening on the period of McCarthyism. And so, for many people that understand or are aware of that time, it's one of the most shameful periods in our history, of the 20th century at least. But he is kind of hearkening, he's kind of saying, like, let's make America great again. Let's go back to this period where we were, on guard, essentially. Talk a little bit about that. This is kind of, he's saying this without much comment or reflection.
Sure. I mean, I think we have already, for at least a decade now, we've already been in an era of a new McCarthyism. After 9/11, we deported, hundreds of thousands of people simply because they're Muslim. We've already put every mosque in the United States under surveillance simply for being a mosque. That atmosphere is already there. Don't forget when we talk about McCarthyism, McCarthy was, as far as the establishment were concerned, McCarthy was the guy who went too far and discredited much longer-term practices that were in place throughout the Cold War, not just in that particular short period in the 1950s. And in a way, Trump, I think, is probably seen by the security establishment in a similar way. The objection from them to Trump would be, why are you actually putting out there in such an overt way what we're doing already? Let's just do it quietly.
And so, his rhetoric is having real consequences throughout the country. Just yesterday, mourners gathered in New York City outside of the Al Furqan Jain Mosque and at the funeral of a Muslim imam and his associate who were gunned down over the weekend. As there was an arrest in that case, but many people in the Bangladeshi community in Queens believe that this was a hate crime and it was fueled by Donald Trump's rhetoric.
Well, and I think that's right. And I think what we've seen over the last few years is a new kind of Islamophobia, right? In fact, it's something that begins really with President Obama coming to the White House. And at that point, a kind of very conspiratorial way of thinking starts to emerge from kind of Islamophobic networks in the kind of conservative sections of the internet and so forth. And their conspiracy theory is essentially Muslims are already running the United States, right? It's that kind of conspiracy theory. The Muslim Brotherhood has taken over the State Department. President Obama is secretly a Muslim working for the Muslim Brotherhood. We are on the verge of losing the United States to Sharia government. That kind of idea, right? Now, that was, until Trump, that was a very marginal fringe phenomenon amongst certain conservative networks. Trump has mainstreamed it. Trump's advisors are the ideologues for that conspiracy theory. People like Frank Gaffney, who's the kind of major influence on Trump's speech yesterday. So what Trump is doing is mainstreaming something that had been a far-right fringe conspiracy theory with Islamophobia at its core. And again, if we're thinking about historical parallels, for me, the historical parallel here is with the old anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that you would have seen gradually becoming mainstream 100 years ago, that blamed Jews for all the problems in the world, that had this idea that Jews were secretly controlling the world. Well, today, it's the same thing, but with Muslims. Muslims are secretly controlling the world. We have a Muslim supposedly in the White House and so forth. So, and that doesn't mean that, where we're heading is necessarily exactly the same as the fate of Jews in the mid-20th century in Europe. But what we're dealing with has the same kind of structure. It's this kind of racist conspiratorial thinking.
And Arun, so as Trump, I guess, gets more desperate in his rhetoric, he's not doing well in the polls. What are your thoughts going forward as we kind of sort of get closer to the election? Final thoughts about the significance of the speech and these proposals.
Yeah, I think whoever's in the White House in January, what Trump's campaign has demonstrated is that there is a very significant number of people in the United States who, rather than being turned off by this kind of rhetoric, have actually rushed towards it. Until very recently, this Islamophobic component of Trump's campaign has won in votes, not lost in votes. So whoever's in the White House in January will know that maybe 50% of the population of the United States, according to opinion polls, thinks that Muslims are dangerous, is suspicious of them, and buys into a good deal of the Islamophobic rhetoric that we've seen from Trump. And that will shape policy making going forward. That will shape the climate in this country going forward, even if Trump is defeated. There's reasons why. I think if with Clinton in the White House, we can also expect a kind of increase in kind of military action in the Middle East, which again will have consequences in terms of an Islamophobic atmosphere here, feeding into that in a different way from what Trump would bring. So, I think either way, unfortunately, over the next year or so, we are looking at a very dangerous atmosphere in the United States with regard to Islamophobia. I think we need a lot more activism, a lot more engagement across all communities on this issue, to really change minds and to challenge some of the policies and kind of official patterns of policy making that are behind a lot of this.
All right, we want to thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you for joining us at the Real News Network.